Hey, welcome back to S&S Grills. I'm Jabin from Postal Barbecue, and today at the grill, I'm going to show you how to make some smoky and delicious beef ribs for your next cook, so take a look. As I said, welcome back to S&S Grills. I appreciate you being here. If you haven't yet hit that subscribe button as well as that notification bell, I encourage you to do so right now so you don't miss out on any great barbecue videos just like this one. Today at the grill, I'm going to be smoking up this delicious 4-bone rack of beef ribs. And if you've never had beef ribs like this before, you've only really done the beef back ribs, this is the next thing on your list, because when you have beef short ribs or beef plate ribs, the flavor of that meat is absolutely wonderful. It's almost like eating brisket on a stick. And as I mentioned, this is a 4-bone rack of beef ribs, and I did start preparing this yesterday. The first thing I did was I scored the back of the membrane because I am going to leave that on, but I just want it to breathe a little bit easier. Next, I removed all of the surface fat as well as the silver skin. You will notice that there is a little bit of a fat decal still on there. I chose to leave that on just so that we have a similar thickness from the left side to the right side. And then lastly, I applied some kosher salt to the top surface as well as the sides, and then I placed it in the fridge covered so it could dry brine overnight. And one of the things that you'll notice now on day number 2 is that the meat has darkened up a little bit. It's a little more rich ruby red color, and the salt now has penetrated into the center, the core of these beef ribs, which means that the meat is going to be more tender as well as going to be perfectly seasoned. So to finish preparing my beef back ribs, there's only a couple things that I'm going to do. The first thing is going to apply a little bit of Worcestershire sauce to the outside surface, and this is going to be a little bit of a binder, as well as it's going to help pull out some of that natural beef flavor. Next, I'm going to be applying our Not Just for Beef rub, and this rub goes incredibly well on all things beef, so it's going to provide a lot of great flavor. And so go ahead and just sprinkle some of that onto the outside surface. Make sure we get all of our edges as well. And because I am using a combination of that dry brine process as well as the Not Just for Beef rub, which has no salt in it, it means that I can apply as much or as little of that barbecue rub as I like. And so with these beef ribs all prepared, let me show you how I set up the Slow N Sear Kettle for today's cook. So to set up the Slow N Sear Kettle today, I'm using the Slow N Sear basket with the water reservoir still in place, as well as our driven griddle pan. And so to get everything set up, I first of all placed in about 15 briquettes into the corner of the Slow N Sear basket, and I got those coals fully lit. Once those coals are fully lit, I then filled up the remainder of the Slow N Sear basket with unlit briquettes, as well as I added hot water to the water reservoir, only about halfway full. Once the Slow N Sear Kettle was filled up, I then closed the lid and adjusted my top vent about 1/3 of the way open, as well as the smoke hole 1/3 of the way open with our bottom vent fully closed. Alright, so I have the kettle set up for cooking between 250 and 275 degrees. I'm probably going to lock in this cook today around 260 degrees, but anywhere within that range is going to be great for this cook today. And so let's get our beef back ribs onto the grill opposite the coals. Next, because my ribs are so thick, I'm going to place a digital thermometer into the thickest part of this beef rib, about there. And then lastly, I'm going to add on a couple pieces of hickory wood to add a little bit of smoky flavor. And then so with everything on the grill, I'm going to close up this lid, and I'm going to begin smoking this for a number of hours. This is a full day cook, and so I'm going to let it go for about 3 to 4 hours to start with, and I'll come back about halfway through that time to give it a spritz and just check up on that rack of ribs just to make sure it's cooking the way that I want to. Guys, it smells absolutely incredible back here. I've been smoking our beef ribs on the Slow N Sear Kettle for about 2.5 hours now, and this is around the time I like to open up the grill, get a good visual on it, give it a spritz if it's needed, and just sort of see in general how these ribs are cooking along. And so let's open up the grill and take a look. All right, guys, just take a look at this. You can see that our bark is starting to form. There are a few dry spots on the surface of the ribs, but in general, these are cooking perfectly. So I'm just gonna hit it with a light spray of a combination of water and apple cider vinegar, just to add a little bit of hydration to the surface of these ribs. There we go. So I'm going to quickly close up my lid again, and I'm going to continue to smoke these ribs until I have the bark that I'm looking for. I want that bark to be set up nicely so that it doesn't come off when I wrap it in my butcher's paper. So we'll come back when it's time to wrap. These beef ribs have been cooking for just over 4 hours now, and the kettle temperature has been rock steady around that 260-degree mark. And so I did open up the grill about 20 minutes ago or so just to see how close these beef ribs were to being wrapped. And so I want to show you what they look like now and what I'm looking for before I wrap. So guys, just take a look at this. You can see, first of all, that the bark is fully set up. It's got a nice dark color to it. It's not gonna come off in the wrap. You'll see a good amount of bone pullback on those ribs. And then lastly, my internal temperature of these ribs has kind of plateaued. So I'm gonna quickly remove this from the grill. Place it right in the center of my butcher's paper. I'm also going to quickly close up this lid so that my temperature doesn't get away from me. As I mentioned, today I'm going to be wrapping these beef ribs in butcher's paper, and the reason is I want to protect that bark as well as allow that paper just to breathe a little bit so we're not steaming it as much as we would with foil. If you only have foil, go for it. It's going to be a great option for you as well. And so before I wrap it, I'm just going to give it a quick spritz. I'm also going to spritz some of the butcher's paper. So to wrap this, I'm just going to fold this over, fold the ends in. There we go, just like that. And so with it all wrapped, let's get it back onto the grill. And then just like last time, I'm going to grab my S&S 500 and place that about the same section as it was before, right in between the middle of those bones. And then with our ribs back on the grill, let's get that lid closed. And now's the time I want to be cooking to tenderness. I'm still going to be holding a grill temperature between 250 and 275 degrees. And I'm not overly concerned about my internal temperature. Rather, I'm looking for it to be probe tender. So when I take my S&S 100 and probe it into the meat, it's just going to glide in just like softened butter. And that's when I know these ribs are going to be done. So we'll come back when these are getting close to probe tender. All right, so it's been just under 7 hours total cooking time, and my S&S 500 is reading 203 degrees, and it's usually somewhere around 200 and 205 degrees where you get the tenderness that you're looking for when it comes to beef ribs, brisket, pulled pork, and so that's why we're checking it now. And so let's open up the grill and just probe for tenderness. Oh, that feels really nice. Yeah, guys, these beef ribs are incredibly tender, so I'm gonna call them done. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove them from the grill. I'm gonna let them rest for about 45 minutes to an hour, just to allow those juices to recirculate throughout the ribs. And at that point, we'll open them up and we'll get ready for the taste test. All right, just to recap, I started these beef ribs yesterday by removing the fat and the silver skin, as well as dry brining them and placing them in the fridge overnight. I then applied the Worcestershire as well as the notches for beef rub, and then placed it on the smoker for about 7 hours, wrapping partway through, and this is what we're left with. I'm gonna grab my knife and I'm gonna just slice in between the bones. Oh, it's just slicing like butter. I'm gonna go for this guy right here and just take a look at that. They're still incredibly juicy. There's a nice smoke ring on there. Oh, I can't wait to go for the taste test, so here we go. Oh my goodness. This is so good. That first bite was incredibly tender. You can really pick up the flavor of that rub, as well as the kosher salt that I put on there is perfectly seasoned. You can really taste that beef rub as well as the saltiness from that dry brine. It's really just like eating brisket on a stick. This is phenomenal. I'm gonna go for another bite. You know, a big rack of beef ribs like this never disappoints. It does take a little bit of extra time to cook it, but the results speak for themselves. If you've never tried to smoke up a rack of beef ribs like this before, make sure to give it a try because you're not going to be disappointed. I'm going to go ahead and finish this bone and enjoy my feast. This is unreal. So that's how you make those delicious and smoky beef ribs using the Slow N Sear Kettle. I hope you give it a try, and remember, 2 zones are better than 1.